an exclusivity provision and a non-compete. It'll probably be called, it might be called one or it could be called either. It basically says you can't, okay, I would differentiate them this way. An exclusivity provision cares about how you being available to the practice to work for them, for the group or the hospital, whoever it is, right? A non-compete cares about you not competing with them. So you're more likely to see an exclusive, well, either way, they're both very common. Both are okay during the term of the agreement. Once you finish working, so like let's say you work for them for 2 years, they have no say in what you do after the agreement. So you may see this, it shouldn't be in an agreement, but I still see it, where it says something like, during the term of this agreement and for a period of 2 years after termination, physician may not render professional medical services to any patients within a 10-mile radius of the practice. That is invalid. That 2-year part, that's invalid. One thing to be aware of though is some contracts have it, still invalid, it's in there, and some contracts attach money to it. So they'll say things like, should physician violate this provision, practice reserves the right to charge physician $1,000 per patient, or to proceeding, file for damages of $10,000. They'll make up something. It's not valid, and they will not win in on that. But if they think there's money attached to it, they may go ahead and try and scare you. If I see that in a contract, and I see especially that it's attached to money, it gives me pause because I wonder what kind of practice is this that has a crappy lawyer, or it's just me. So that's what I do. Sometimes they have no idea, and they're like, oh God, my lawyer did that, XX, yay. But if they actually stick to that, like, that's bad.
And that's California specific.
California specific, yes. So those of you who are seeking work outside of California, some states allow non-competes post-termination. They always have to be reasonable in time, scope, and duration, or less time. Anyway, they have to be reasonable. So it can't be 50 years, 50 miles, forever and all time. Apparently in like Manhattan, they're like 3 block radiuses and things like this. So they may be enforceable elsewhere, but not in California.
What if the patients follow you?
Okay, so she just asked, what if the patients follow you after you leave the practice? The issue of what patients do is, and whether you encourage patients to follow you, that's usually going to be covered in a non-solicitation provision, and we're going to get to that. But that's an important point. Patients can do whatever they want. That's me. Okay, so as for compensation and benefits, there are a lot of different formulas for compensation. To return to what I said at the beginning, this is one of those places where you really want to get good information from your peers about how much they're making, what their salaries include, if it's productivity-based, if there's a base salary, if there are different kinds of bonuses and such, just to get a sense of whether what you're being offered is fair or normal. And if it's, sub-market, that's either a signal that maybe you want to ask for more money, or maybe you want to ask for more vacation, or maybe you might have some wiggle room on some other provisions if the practice can't bring the compensation up to market rates. So we'll see often base salary with a potential year-end bonus based on productivity. They will never ever, well, okay, that's an exaggeration. Oftentimes what the bonus is based on is not laid out very clearly in the contract. They'll just say performance-based bonus, productivity-based. Sometimes it's really clear. Like sometimes it'll say, for all collections above $500,000 attributable to physician shall earn 10% of those collections above $500,000. So if you get $600,000, that's $100,000. You get 10% of $100,000, and that's your bonus. Other times it's a lot more vague. Whether you can get a whole lot of clarity on that kind of depends on the employer. It's a good, if it's more vague, it's a good sense. I would ask, what are the criteria? How often are these bonuses awarded? Are they ever withheld? What am I aiming for here? Sometimes you'll see compensation based on a percentage of billing or collections. Those are completely different things, right? Because collections are usually like 60% of bills. So if your compensation is based on billing, you'll probably get a lower percentage. If it's based on collections, you'll probably get a higher percentage because of what those numbers actually are. That's actually less common. That's something you'd more likely see in an independent contractor arrangement. One thing to know though is if your compensation is based on collections, it's going to be delayed like 60 or 90 days because that's how long it takes for the money to come back in. Sometimes you'll see salaries based on a percentage of gross revenues minus gross expenses. That's another way of saying a percentage of net income. Also less common. Sometimes it's based on productivity. But I think the thing I see the most is that there's a base salary with a series of bonuses that you might be able to earn, and frequently a productivity bonus. Sometimes salaries, and this is more typical of larger systems, Kaiser, Sutter, some of the larger systems will base salaries on RVUs, which are relative value units. Relative value units are meant to reflect the volume of work, effort, and skill expended in treating a patient. The amount of money assigned to a relative value unit varies by geographical region. And so sometimes you'll see the contract will say something like, we pay the median of WRVUs for the Western region. So you know they're paying right down the middle of what practices pay that are paying based on RVUs. I'm seeing that more and more, like I said, especially with larger entities. And each entity has its own formula, but often it's referencing the what's called the MGMA service, the MGMA survey, the Medical Group Management Association of America survey, which is available online. If the contract doesn't say it doesn't reference the MGMA survey, so that they don't say we're paying 50% or we're paying the median of whatever the MGMA rate is for our region, you can still reference that survey to get a sense of what's normal for where you are. So I think it's a really helpful thing. It's the Medical Group Management Association of America, and they've got a lot of good information. Okay, so sometimes the contract will reference shareholder and partnership opportunities. The language around this is almost always vague, and it'll say things like, in the event that physician completes the term of this agreement, practice may or may not offer physician a partnership position or the opportunity for partnership in the practice under terms and conditions to be negotiated at that time, but this provision is not a guarantee that said offer shall be made at any point in time. So like that's what you'll get. And they won't clarify it, and frankly, if you were in their position, you wouldn't either, because everyone wants to get to know each other before they make you a partner. But one thing to be aware of is that because these provisions, the situation is kind of dicey, like there's no guarantee, you should proceed with caution. So if you're being offered a partnership opportunity in exchange for a lower salary, I'm not sure that's the best deal. It may or may not be, but it's just really hard to gauge because again, they're not obligated to, under any contract I've seen, they will never commit to partnership right out the gate. So proceed with caution, particularly if you're accepting a lower salary as a result of an option, excuse me, of a partnership offer. One way you could try and lock it down is by purchasing an option. So an option is a separate agreement where the practice agrees that should you finish out your contract, so let's say you've got a 3-year contract, at the end of that contract, you then have the option to buy shares in the practice up to a certain amount at a certain rate. In general, I see that for physicians who are further along in their practice, partly because they've got the cash to buy in at some point, and also just because, again, very few practices are offering a partnership opportunity to anyone who's not a pretty well-known entity. So, but going in the future, once you've got a few years under your belt, and you're joining a practice and you might want to give pressure, one way to lock that down is with an option agreement. Okay. The contract, either in the body of the contract or in a separate benefits section, will address vacation, sick leave, and CME benefits. Paid vacation, usually I see at least 2 weeks of paid vacation. Sick leave might be 1 to 2 weeks additional. I'd say if you're getting anything less than 2 weeks of paid vacation a year, that's a bummer. Like, I hope you get at least 2. And 2, I often see more, but 2 is kind of well, it's up to you, but 2 is one thing you should, I know as residents, you're like, that sounds fantastic. No, okay, good. So one thing you should know is that in California, paid time off is considered a form of wages. So if at the end of your contract, decide not to renew and you've got a week's worth of time off accrued, paid time off, they need to pay that out to you. That's money. So make sure that you get paid for your paid time off upon termination if you've accrued any. Another thing to ask when you see vacation provisions in a contract, especially if you're working for a smaller group, ask if people actually take their vacation. Because it's nice if it's in there, it's more important that people actually take it. So you want to know if those are benefits that you actually get to enjoy, or if everybody's just working so hard that you'll be the odd person out if you actually take vacation and look like a suspect. Oftentimes, a contract will offer money for CME, so they'll give you an allowance of like $1,000 or $2,000 to attend conferences and get your CME credit. So that's positive. And then you might get additional time off for that. So this is the kind of thing where if you're getting maybe not such a great salary or not such a great schedule, this is a sweetener. Obviously, it's not going to make up for a salary that's 20% less than your friends, but it's something that they can throw in. You might also, hopefully, you'll see that you've got health, dental, and vision benefits. Those are typically referenced in the contract, but they're not explained. So it'll say like, physicians shall be eligible for those benefits that are offered other other employees of the practice at the time of employment. So you're just going to get what everybody else gets, because that's how those things are negotiated by the group itself. And the other things to think about, if you are expected to travel for work, if you're working at a few different clinics, you want to find out if your travel is covered, if your cell phone is covered, things like that. Another thing to find out about is if they are paying your dues for different professional organizations, your licensing fees, your DEA fees. Most employers will pay those. If you were an independent contractor, they wouldn't. But if you're an employee, most employers will cover those expenses as well. Oftentimes you will see a signing bonus, sometimes a relocation bonus, sometimes a signing bonus and a relocation bonus. That's all good. The thing to be aware of is that oftentimes there's a repayment provision. So it'll say something like, you get $10,000 as a signing bonus, but if you leave before the end of 2 years, you have to pay us back. And you have to pay us back fast, and if you don't pay us back fast, there's 7% interest. So read that part carefully, because what looks like the greatest Christmas present of all time could be really sucky if you don't finish out your contract. So look for the payback provision. Virtually all contracts will require you to have credentials at a hospital unless hospital care is not part of your job at all. It's important to make friends with the person at the hospital that handles credentialing, because it's a lot of paper. Some of you maybe have gone through this process or known other people. It's a lot of paperwork, and you want to be friends with that person so they don't lose your paperwork. And also denial of status. I've dealt with contracts or situations where physicians got fired basically because their credentialing process went wrong through no fault of their own, just that the credentialing people at that particular hospital weren't so on the ball, and then this doctor ended up not fulfilling a necessary condition of a contract, and she got the boot and had a repayment provision, and that was bad. So get your credentials sorted out. You should know if a hospital denies your privileges, that's going to trigger what's called an 805 report, which is a report to the medical board. That's bad, and if you find yourself in that position, get a lawyer. Don't mess around with hospital privileges. If your hospital, there are lawyers who specialize in peer review and privileging and credentialing. You want one of those lawyers. I'm not one of them, but you want one of those lawyers to help you out, because that stuff is serious. An 805 report is on your record for life. Like, you do not want that on your record. Maybe not for life, but for a long time. And it will screw up your ability to work.
Wait, what does that really mean? Like,
an 805 report?
Yeah.
An 805 report, like I said, if you get denied privileges at a hospital, or if you have privileges and they get stripped because of some kind of bad behavior on your part, you have to admit that every time you feel like it'll be, for example, it'll be a condition of employment that you don't have one. That other hospitals won't credential you if they see you got an 805 report based on prior acts. It's just a big roadblock for you going forward. It's not impossible, but it's not good.
Is there any contesting it?
Oh yeah,
Did
it's
they
a process. Yeah.
They just do it out of sheer like prejudice? I mean,
They
it's like
can-
what goes into the credentialing
Right,
process. It's really subjective.
You have to have due process. You have to have notice and a hearing. So, no, they can't just do it automatically. There's a whole administrative process around it. 805 refers to Business and Professions Code 805, which is the state law addressing this, and there's a process. So no, that's why you should get a lawyer, because you want somebody to intervene for you and represent you in that process.
So as folks who are leaving training,
Yeah.
credentialing can take a long time.
Yes.
So as they're walking out the door of residency or fellowship, how do they make sure that there's like not this big gap between getting credentialed so they can meet the demands of their new opportunity?
That's a good question. So he was asking if being credentialed at the hospital, at X hospital, is a condition of working for this group, and that can take a long time. How do you make sure that everything's lined up? One thing is that usually employment contracts, like I'm reviewing employment contracts right now for people who are starting work in August. So they'll sign the contract 6 months in advance so that they have time for that. Also, if the group really wants you to work and it's just kind of a fact of life that credentialing is going to take some time, they'll cut you some slack on that.
Also, do you see differences in staff privileges from the county system versus advisors, for-profits? Do they have varying timelines or?
I haven't seen differences, but I also haven't looked at them. So nobody's come to me and said like, oh my gosh, it took 8 years at Kaiser and 2 weeks at county. Okay, moving on. Most contracts that you see will have provisions on malpractice insurance. They all will cover malpractice insurance, and most will have indemnification. Oh wait, we need to just close the door and then. Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So let's do these separately. Okay, so great. So malpractice insurance, this is a biggie. This is a biggie. There are different kinds of malpractice insurance. There is occurrence-based malpractice and claims-made and tail. Occurrence-based malpractice coverage is the better kind. Occurrence is better. Why? Occurrence-based coverage covers you for an event that happens during the policy term, even if the person doesn't sue you until after the policy is over. Okay? So even if the claim is filed 2 years later, as long as you were covered by Carrier A when the underlying event took place, Carrier A will cover you for that event. Meaning they'll provide you a lawyer, they'll pay the fees, and they'll pay the settlement costs. If you have claims-made insurance, you will only be covered for claims that are filed during the policy term, okay? So if your claims-made policy goes from January 1st, 2015 to December 31st, 2015, and something bad happens on December 1st, 2015, and that person doesn't get around to suing you until January 1st, 2016, your claims-made policy will not cover you. And that's why you'll need tail insurance. Tail insurance will cover you for claims that are based on events that took place during a policy term, but a claims-made policy term when the claim isn't filed until after the policy term. So basically, occurrence-based insurance is like claims-made plus tail. If you don't have occurrence, that means you have claims-made and you will need tail coverage. Tail coverage is very expensive. The premiums are typically something like 130% of your premiums for regular coverage, and it will vary according to your specialty, your geographic region, and the years in employment practice. So just to give you an idea, I worked with a physician who was a breast surgeon here in LA, and she was leaving an employer after 2 years. Those were her first 2 years of private practice or post-fellowship. And her tail insurance cost for just having been in practice for 2 years, admittedly in a pretty difficult specialty, a pretty litigious area, was going to be $57,000. So this is serious money. And if you're going to be covering your tail insurance, you think about how that will affect your compensation. Just go ahead and factor it in. You can get more information by calling the different malpractice insurance companies, the doctor's company, for example, and just ask for kind of a ballpark figure to get a sense of what you might be walking into.
So how different are the rates and coverages based on the doctor's company or NorCal or?
Sorry,
corporate?
you should, you'll just
You
have
gotta
to.
shop around a little
You
bit.
shop around a little bit. Sometimes if you're joining a group, even if you're individually responsible for your coverage, they'll be able to get you a better rate. Like they're all covered by the doctor's company, and if you go with the doctor's company too, you'll get a lower rate because of the volume. So you want to know in your contract who's paying for malpractice coverage. If the employee is responsible for securing malpractice coverage, then that means you have to get it, and maybe they'll reimburse you for it. That would be good. If the employer handles malpractice insurance, that's great, and you just pay for it all at once. But you want to see the certificate of coverage to make sure they haven't let it lapse. Because I've seen that before too, and that is not true. So if they cover it, great. That's standard. Ask for the certificate in a nice and friendly way, but get it. And with regard to tail insurance, first of all, if you have any say in it, you want occurrence-based insurance. If they don't do occurrence-based insurance and they only do claims-based insurance, you have to do different options. You could insist on occurrence-based insurance, and because you are the greatest candidate of all time, you'll get it. If that route doesn't work for you, you can try offering to pay the difference between tail insurance and between claims-made insurance and occurrence-based insurance. You'd have to do some homework and find out what that difference is. Or you can try to get them to cover all of the tail insurance. That's best in the claims-made scenario. Or oftentimes you'll see in a contract that depending on the time, the amount of time you work for them, they pay an increasing amount of the tail costs. So for example, if you work for them for 1 year, they cover no tail. If you work for them for 2 years, they cover 50%. If you work for 3 years, they cover 75%, and after 3 years, they cover all of it. That's fairly common, and that's something you could try and get built into your contract. Something to note is that under California law, there's actually an argument that the employer should always cover tail insurance, and that if they don't actually cover tail insurance, even if you get sued, they should indemnify you. Because if you were working at their behest, they are responsible, and you were acting within the scope of your job, you weren't doing anything wild or crazy, you were actually doing what you were supposed to be doing, these things went badly, they should cover you under the legal doctrine of respondeat superior, which basically says that employers are responsible for the acts of their employees. So you could forward the claim onto them or name them as a defendant. Not a really pretty situation, so I would try and get occurrence-based coverage or get them to cover tail or get them to cover some part of tail. Nose insurance? Yeah, there's something called nose insurance or prior acts insurance. That seems to be fairly infrequent, but some employers will offer nose insurance. In general, they don't want to because, like, why do they want to cover you if they weren't even employing you? But it comes up every once in a while.
Apologies for asking questions because it's a
Right,
complicated
okay.
issue.
It is.
When you work for FQHCs, or if you work for the VA system, or if you're a civilian physician working for the military, do some of these rules change?
That I know of, no. But I'm not certain. Okay. You will also see in contracts indemnification provisions or whole harmless causes. This is a little complicated, but basically the idea behind indemnification provisions, the basic idea is that, okay, let's say you work in a clinic and there's a hole in the carpet and you did not cause the hole in the carpet. It's just there and they didn't fix it. And one of your patients takes a flying dive, like trips on that hole in the carpet, falls and breaks their nose. Okay, that has nothing to do with medical care. You didn't do it, but they might just go ahead and sue you because they will sue everybody within a 50-mile radius if something like that happens. And so in that sad event, an indemnification provision would say the practice will indemnify you when you are sued as a result of bad behavior by the practice. Okay? So they didn't fix the carpet, you got sued, they should pay your legal fees. The other way that goes is if you get into a fist fight with a patient that has nothing to do with medical care and you break their nose and then they sue you and they sue the clinic, you will indemnify the clinic. or if you made the hole in the carpet, right? But anyway, you will indemnify the clinic for non-medical practice-based errors, right? Oftentimes, these will be one way. So it'll just say physician indemnifies the practice, but the practice isn't indemnifying physician. I always try and make those mutual. Because again, in like the hole in the carpet scenario, you don't want to be responsible if somebody takes a dive. It's not your fault. So I would try and get those to be mutual. The language is often complicated on those, but just read it and try and make sure that it's mutual. It should just say physician, each party indemnifies the other, or physician indemnifies practice, and practice indemnifies physician. You just don't want to see it going only one way, unless it's just that they're indemnifying. Okay, which one are in some contracts, you may see an overpayment provision, which says that in the event that a third-party payer, meaning an insurance company, Medicare, or Medi-Cal, demands repayment of money paid out for patient care, you will cover those costs. So, for example, if you provide treatment, the insurance company pays, they have a year to go back and say, oh, we screwed up, we shouldn't have paid for that, give us the money back. And in some contracts, it will say, if that's you, if that happens to you, to your patient that they're trying to get money back on, you will pay for it. That is not good. Get that out of there. Because oftentimes you don't really, as a physician, you don't have a lot of say in how things are billed. You may or may not, but you're not necessarily doing the coding. You need to make sure your documentation is solid. But beyond that, the billers sometimes do magical things, and sometimes those things are great, and sometimes they result in what we call an overpayment, which is actually a repayment demand. And those can be really expensive. So if the contract states that you're responsible for that, if you can't just get the whole thing cut, you want to make sure that it's explicit that you are only responsible for an overpayment if it's your fault. Like you were doing crappy documentation, or you were saying that you were doing an E&M service when really you just like waved at the patient and walked away. I mean, you wouldn't do that, but this is the kind of thing that happens. So you don't want to be responsible for that. Because it can be a lot of money, and it can be and these things come years after the fact. Even though they only have a year to do it, they'll do it for they'll go 3 years back and try to get it. So avoid. Okay, the contract will also set out the term, and most of the time there'll be an established term. Frequently, most common for post residency contracts is 1 or 2 years. 3 years is a bit on the longer end, but most commonly I see like 2 years is often the case. Sometimes there will be an automatic renewal provision, so it'll say this contract shall last for 2 years and shall automatically renew for 1 year periods thereafter, unless otherwise terminated by the president. So contracts will often say you have a 2-year term, but you're at will. Now, at will technically means that there's no fixed duration, and you can be fired at any time for any reason other than a discriminatory reason. Some people argue that if you have a written contract with clear terms and conditions for termination, like you can only be fired for these reasons, that's not at will, because they can't just fire you for any reason, they have to have a reason. Other people will say that even with all of those terms and conditions, you're still at will because the contract is yours. Chances are you're at will. It's a strong presumption. But basically it means that you can be fired, again, at any time for any reason or no reason except for discrimination. So not on the basis of gender, religion, race, sexual orientation, age, and so on. But maybe they can tell you because they don't like you for some other reason. Okay, so be aware of that. You probably can't change it, but it's just good to know what it means. Okay, so we can move on. The term in a contract, and I know we seem like we're going in a weird order, but this is often the order that things appear in. The term is the length of time the employer is bound to hire you. Like I said, 1 to 3 years is typical, 2 years is the most typical. Termination, there's 2 types of termination. Or 3 really. There's for cause, meaning like you did something bad or something that we deem bad, and oftentimes there will be a cure period. So it'll say something like, if you failed to render services in a professional manner and didn't remedy the situation within 15 days of receipt of written notice thereof, you're out. So there's for cause termination, you stole money from the practice, you did something really bad. Without cause termination is what it sounds like we're just firing you because of a reduction in staff, or we just decided we're not friends, something like that. That's without cause termination. And then there's automatic termination, where like if you lose your license, that's like automatic termination. So automatic termination is just sort of a species of for cause termination, but those are the different types of termination we see. In general, there will be a notice period. So with for cause termination, what you want to see is that you have a chance to fix the problem. So if they identify a problem in your patient care, or you're not doing your charting right, or something else is going wrong, you want to see it written that you're not going to get fired until you've had written notice and a certain period of time to correct the problem. That's for cause termination. Without cause termination means, like I said, you just get fired because things aren't working out, or they're closing the practice or something like that. Usually there's between the time periods for no cause termination or without cause termination range from like 15 days to like 90 days. And usually it's mutual. So usually it says the practice can terminate physician without cause upon 30 days written notice, and physician can terminate his contract upon 30 days written notice to practice. Sometimes they have to give you 30 days and you have to give them 60 days. I like to see it equal. The one thing is, so with that cause termination makes people feel nervous, and it's understandable because really at the end of the day, when you have a without cause termination provision with a 30-day notice period, you've got a 30-day contract. Like that's all you're actually doing with your team. So that makes people feel nervous. On the other hand, if you totally hate them, you only have to be there for 30 days. Or, and I think this is particularly relevant for people who may be moving across the country and all their families in California and they're moving to New York, or vice versa, or they have family overseas or something. If you've got, you have a serious family emergency that means you've got to get out of there and relocate, those kind of no cause termination provisions are important. Because they mean you can terminate and you're not breaching. If you terminate, if you've got a 30-day termination provision, notice period, and you terminate earlier, so like I'm supposed to give 30 days notice and I only give 2 weeks, technically I'm in breach of contract and they could sue me for damages. They may not, but they could.